Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Good evening to you too, Hayden. Good evening. Great. All right, yeah. I feel like it's been weeks since I've seen you guys or since we've talked, but I know it's only been like I guess it's been 2 weeks, so it has been a while. That's the thing about having only one meeting a week. Korea was very fun. It was very hot and very humid. It was like 90% humidity every day I was there, but I got to go to a lot of museums. I got to go to some of the palaces in Seoul. I got to eat a lot of delicious food. So it was very fun. Oh, really? I wonder how Busan humidity was. Busan is basically the weather in Korea is the same all the way around, although Busan is tends to be I think a little less humid than Seoul, but I don't know. Okay. Are we seeing the PowerPoint? Good. Where is the here it is. All right, so welcome everyone. We are in week 4, and we're going to start talking about the early 20th century, basically Japanese colonialism, and we're going to be talking a lot about identity. Next week, we're going to be talking a lot about nationality. So this is a really fun unit. Unfortunately, I wasn't here to talk to us about Minjung art. Minjung art is actually one of my favorite things to teach. But it seems like based on what I saw in your blog responses and your planner, well, your responses to the video, everyone seems to be on the right track with understanding what was going on and everything. So, unfortunately, we weren't able to go through that together, but I think we still got it. So a couple of things. First, so grades. So I noticed that some of us are a little bit behind on our grades on submitting assignments. And so I just want to tell everyone, if you are still attending class, but you haven't really been doing your assignments, the best thing for you to do is just start doing your assignments now and turn them in on time, rather than going back and trying to make up everything, because you're just going to get more and more behind if that's what you decide to do. So, if that's you, I suggest going forward, you just worry about what's due and getting it done on time each week rather than going back. Um, if you have questions about grades, you can reach out to me. I think everything is up to date except for the grades today. There's a few of you who I didn't get to grading your blog responses. So, but basically everything should be up to date. And generally speaking, everyone is doing really well, I think. So, you should be very happy with your work thus far in the course. I also published the extra credit assignment. I got word back from the museum, and we are going to be able to do the 2 different museum sessions. Probably like the week before, I'll do during the in-person session, I'll just try and get a head count of who is coming and when. But you can download it uh, under the modules. I just realized I didn't share my screen. I shared my there we go, PowerPoint. So under the modules, here we go. You should see this document, and it says extra credit fall 2023. This is an explanation of the assignment that you'll need to do either by yourself if you're not going to go to the in-person session, or what we will be doing during the in-person session. So everything should be able to be done at the museum for it. That's kind of how I've done it. You will need to take your computer with you to the museum to do it, if you're able to do that. If not, you can still like do it when you come back or something. So if you have questions or issues with that, just let me know as they come up. Okay, are there any questions about anything thus far with assignments or in the course or everything? I feel like even though we didn't have last week, everyone is still pretty up to date. I was really worried that some of us would get confused and fall behind, but you can start doing the extra credit whenever. You can turn it in. It just has to be turned in, and it says on the paper it has to be turned in by October, the last Friday of the session, which I don't remember what that is now. I think it's October 13th. Yeah, I think it's Friday the 13th. So yeah. Great question. All right. So midterm. So hopefully everyone has downloaded and looked at the midterm. I know I didn't show you how to do that yet, but it seems pretty intuitive. So it became available on Monday. So if you're on the modules and you go down to week 4, which is what we're in, and under the graded assignments, there's this midterm exam right here. You click on it, it'll take you to this, what looks like this. I'm not in student view, but let's see what it looks like to student view. It'll look like this in student view, and you can download the document, which has your midterm. It is a Word document. And the images that appear on the midterm, you can also download individually here. If you have any issues accessing any of these documents or the images, please let me know as soon as possible. Nobody has yet, so I'm assuming they're fine. So when you download it, it should look like this, hopefully. Make sure it says fall 2023 session 1. The midterm is different every single session. So you want to make sure you're doing the right one. Type your name, read through the instructions. I'm just going to highlight a few things about the instructions. So remember the deadline is this Friday by 11:59 p.m. So if you were very responsible or you had time on Monday, you should have downloaded it. And so you'll have a total of 5 days to complete this, which should be plenty of time. There's 6 questions. Make sure you answer all the parts of each question. And this is the big thing that people always lose. They usually only lose like 1 or 2 points per question, but then over the entire exam, if you don't do this, that's a lot of points that you've lost. And that is citations. And if you read my announcement on Monday, I noticed last week a lot of us kind of dropped the ball with our citations. We either didn't do one or we just didn't put the right information. And it's really important that you both have a parenthetical citation and you put the right information in for the midterm, because this is part of how many points you get. You get 1 point per thing, per having a citation, having the author name, and having a page or a minute number. So each question, you need to have at least 1 citation. You need to have at least 1 to a material from class. So no outside sources, only things we've read or watched in class that I know what they are, I know what they say, I know they can be trusted. And make sure you follow the parenthetical format. So remember, if it's something you read, it's the author last name, comma, the page number. And then I realized I don't think I ever said this, but and it just never came up. If it's a video, I would prefer that you put a minute number with it, which it's not your fault that if you haven't been doing that, but it should say the title of the video, comma, and then the minute. This just helps me know like whereabouts you got this information in the video. That's not actually a standard thing if you learn how to do any specific manuals of style, but for our class, I would like that. Remember, everything is open book, so go back through your notes, through the sessions, through the readings and everything to help you out. And yes, I think that's everything. So are there any questions about what you need to be doing on this exam exactly? Okay. Oh, word counts. Okay. So yeah, let's talk about word counts. Okay, so if you cite yourself in a blog, so I don't ever see a reason you would cite your own blog except to say that I talked about this in my blog. You're going to need to be able to say something like that and then tell me, what it was that you were talking about. So as long as I know you're just referring back to your, like, what you really should just be restating what you state in your blog. I think somewhere in here, yeah, it says you can blog discussions. I'd prefer that you don't cite yourself as a source of information. You really should be citing other people's. But you can review the blog discussion to remember what we talked about or remember what other people said. Does that make sense? But that's not something you should be citing necessarily. Um, okay, so when we look at the questions, the actual questions themselves, you'll see that everything has like number one, that's the number of the question, and then there's usually an A and a B, which are different parts of the question you're going to answer. So just looking at this one, based on the week 2 course materials and our discussion during the week 2 live plenary session, discuss the following. So I always put an approximate word count of how many words I think you will need in order to get full points for this question. You can go over, but really you shouldn't be doing more than like 250 words because there's 6 of these. You're probably not going to have 2 hours per question to write however much you need to. You're probably going to want to be able to cut it down to about like at most 30 minutes per one question, which is still like a lot of time, right? So I really suggest that you try to be concise and you try to not do too much on the midterm. Just do what the question asks, because the most points I can give you per question is 10. I can't give you more than 10 points. So really you should just be doing 10 points of work. I know maybe you have professors who think you should be doing as much as possible every time, but in this case, this is a lot of work at one time. And I've seen a lot of students struggle because they think they need to put everything down, but you don't in order to get full points. You just need to answer the question that's in front of you. Okay. So that's what I'm going to say about word counts. And that's why I think 100 words, it may seem like not too much, but I really think that that's all you need to answer these 2 questions because they're not that in depth. So what are prominent stereotypes about North Korea and North American media, and how do they compare to reality? So think about it. That might be like 2 or 3 sentences, right? And then has your opinion, view, or belief about North Korea changed or remain the same? Why or why not? Again, 2 or 3 sentences. So do you see how that's maybe like 50 words per each of these things? Like 2 or 3 sentences is about 50 words is like 1 paragraph usually. So does that make sense about the word count? Okay. Yeah, again, I just want to say, do not stress yourself out about writing everything you know. Just answer the question in front of you. All right. So you have this one. So, hopefully you can start thinking about some materials you can refer back to that would help you answer this question, right? We read a few things that talk about this, and we even talked about this particularly in week 2, right? All right, and then you have a visual analysis of this artwork. Now, we did not discuss this artwork in class, but this artwork does appear in one of the readings, and I'm not going to say which one, but I'm just giving you a hint there. Some of the artworks we didn't necessarily discuss, and the point of the visual analysis is to make you go back and think for yourself and try and use the materials in our discussion in class to analyze an artwork by yourself. So visual analysis, I tell you what the text says. Conduct a visual analysis, start by describing the artwork and use your art historical visual analysis vocabulary. So talk about style, genre, medium, composition, iconography, if it's there, which it probably is. And then when you are interpreting it, when you write your interpretation, you need to answer this specific question. Does this artwork qualify as propaganda? Why or why not? Hopefully that question sounds familiar. All right. And then Minjung art. So because we didn't have our meeting last week, I'm going to be very lenient about the answers that appear concerning Minjung art. I generally think everyone will be able to do it properly and have a good answer. So again, 100 words. So think 2 or 3 sentences per part, right? What was the Minjung movement? How stressed, why did it begin? What were its goals? I give you hints. There was 5 goals. Someone and some material listed 5 goals and ultimate accomplishments. And then what is Minjung art? Who are Minjung artists? What media did they work? This might be a little bit more than 100 words, but just don't try and tell everything you know. Just hit the main points. Again, a visual analysis. What Minjung goal does the artwork address? How do you know? Hopefully that sounds familiar. We did with your comparative analysis. And then you have a comparative visual analysis, which we're going to practice doing that today. Everyone seemed to be on track with those, except some of us missed the nuance a little bit, which we'll talk about today because we're going to do comparison. So this is artwork from one is an artwork from North Korea, one is from South Korea. You should have seen both of these before. So start by describing their visual similarities and differences, and then interpret the similarities and differences in regard to their possible meanings. In your interpretation, answer the following. What are the similarities and differences between North and South Korea, as we have learned in class, in terms of how art relates to politics and or society? So we really haven't talked about this before, but I think you should be able to do that for the midterm, right? Because that's all we've been talking about for the past really 3 weeks. Then finally, what we're going to discuss today, which is artist biography and their artwork. So again, visual analysis and your interpretation. How does the artwork relate to the biography? What does the artwork convey about the artist's identities? Okay, and this is the last question. This is 6. So make sure you don't forget about the last question as well. So are there any questions about the midterm? And while I see if there's questions, I'm going to plug my computer in. Sorry. Need to do that. Good. It's basically okay, sorry. It's basically just a bunch of either blog posts or plenary responses at once. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. So, all right. So as it comes up, if you have questions, please just email me and I'll do my best to respond. I'm now that I'm back, I'm basically able to respond quite soon. So all right. So let's actually move into what we're talking about today. So we've been throwing these words around a lot this week, and in the readings and in the videos they do too. So let's just think, what are some things you think of when you hear the terms imperialism and colonialism? What, if somebody asked you to define them, what are some things that you would say to that person? What are some things you would say? Good. Okay. So a nation that overtakes another group of people, typically imposing their own cultural, what is that? What is this? Cultural norms on the oppressed group. Yeah, definitely. So one group of people it becomes or somehow manages to take control over another group of people, and then that group in control tries to oppress the group that's being controlled. And there's a lot of different facets to that. One of those is like cultural control, right? So making people take on the dominant culture, right? Good. So invasion. So one group comes in and invades another group. Good. Yes, good. Land, resources, and power. Yes. So you want to, if you are someone who if you're in a group and you're invading another group and you're probably trying to take their land, some of their resources, which come from the land, and also their human resources, right? And you want power. Good. Good. Colonialism, political control over another country, right? So political control is a major aspect to it, right? Yes, minority groups. So people who end up in the dominated oppressed group in the relationship definitely face a lot of negative effects or have to endure a lot of suffering because of it, right? Good. Yes, we see imperialism. This is good. So Lillian said we see, like, think of Star Wars and the Imperial March, right? Star Wars we have this idea of imperial or right? And it's this idea of a really strong power. Good. Even in fiction and like popular culture, right? We just kind of throw it around. Imperial, the empire of whatever, right? Good. Economic exploitation. Yes, there's a lot of exploitation, exactly, of the land, the people. Good. Good. Okay, so there is a difference here between imperialism and colonialism, and I'm going to talk about it in a moment, but I'm glad Amelia is getting onto that. Imperialism, when a state country attempts to increase its territory control, and colonialism is the extraction of resources. Maybe you're on the right track thinking of them as two different things. Good. Good. Yes. Force their life. Okay, so good. The British Empire. This is a good example. We have a lot of examples like the British Empire, the French Empire. We're talking about the Japanese Empire. And so what they do is they go out, right, and they try and take over other countries and other peoples. And good. Yes, the Roman Empire, same thing. And good. Yes. Ellie says there's still like this centralized government around a specific leader, right? So in the Roman Empire, they had the Roman emperor, right? British Empire, they had the queen and the royal family. So there's still that centralized power, even though they're spread out across a lot of different places. So I think about a lot of different things when I hear these words, and I mean, one of them that really is important is like the idea of expansion, right? So in the US, we are taught about manifest destiny, and that was like the ideology of the 19th century, right? And it's this God-given right that for some reason, these European settlers had to expand across the country and create the US, right? So that belief in one's duty or one's right to just expand continually, right? So that's definitely linked up with these. And then, of course, in the case of North America, that means that people who already were living here, the indigenous peoples from all over the continent, get pushed out. They are killed. They lose their senses of community, their land, and everything like that, right? So see how there's a dominant group and there's an oppressed group in this situation. And okay, so the next picture I'm going to show you is actually going to show some bodily harm and mutilation. You do not need to look at it if you don't want to. So you can just close your eyes, look away for a moment. I'll tell you when it's gone. But I also think of this kind of aspect of imperialism, which is the control of the colonized body, right? So the idea that the colonizer group, in this case, this is the Belgium, right? Belgium in Congo. They have this control over not only the land, but also the humans themselves, and being able to treat them how they want and do with them what they please, right? So in this photograph, we have this, I think he's a member of the royal administration, and to punish the indigenous people of the Congo for not doing what they wanted, they would what is that called, amputate parts of their body, right? And then I also think about museums so much. This is kind of like the legacy of the imperialism and colonialism, right? So all the stuff that the dominant groups took and then brought to their center of power, and they put it all in these buildings that we call museums, right? And so in the US, in North America and Europe particularly, there's a huge movement against or for decolonizing museums. Maybe you've heard of this or not. And the idea of repatriating, so giving things back to people, right? And so even though we like to think that the era of imperialism and colonialism is over, although it's not, right? Because a lot of imperial powers are still in power, the United States being one of them. We still have this everyday legacy in our society that we just kind of overlook. And I think museums are a huge example of that, right? So let's talk about imperialism versus colonialism, because there is a nuance. So the two terms imperial and colonialism are related but slightly different, and their exact definitions are always being debated. So imperial and empire go together, but just because a country does not call itself an empire does not mean that they do not act like one. So imperialism typically refers to the ideology, particularly of expansion via colonizing. An empire typically maintains some form of centralized control over all the areas that it tries to absorb in order to procure its interest in those areas. An empire can be continental or overseas. It does not just have to be overseas. I oftentimes talk to people who say, well, it's not overseas, so it's not an empire. I was like, well, that's kind of irrelevant, right? In practice, empires must assert not only political dominance, but also cultural and economic dominance over the areas into which it has expanded. So the ideology that supports this project can be called imperialism. Colonialism is like the means to an end for this ideology. It's the way through which empires dominate culturally, politically, and economically over those areas by taking them on as a colony, whether that is the word that they use to label the area or not. So you could also hear like territory, protectorate, settlement. There's a lot of different words, but they're all essentially leading towards this very similar idea, right? And so when they take over this area, they try to limit or totally eliminate the sovereignty and autonomy that the people who are already there have over the land. So the land is the most important factor for imperialism and colonialism, because what they boil down to is who has control over the land and everything that comes from that land. So the resources, the people, the space. Colonialism can also just mean broadly setting up a colony, which is the way that settler colonialism, which is a specific type of colonialism, functions. So think about the United States, right? So they would move settlers out into these areas, and they would say, once there's enough settlers in that area, we will officially take that as a territory, quote unquote, right? So colonized means to be part of the group that is dominated by the colonizer, who is the one that dominates. So we have colonized versus colonizer. And this sets up the dichotomy that is always in question when studying imperialism and colonialism. So what is important in learning about imperialism and colonialism is to ask, what issues do colonized people face? What are their experiences, and how does their history as a colonized group affect their present conditions? And so that's what we're thinking about today, particularly with Korea, right? So let's talk about Japanese colonialism and the Korean Peninsula. So Japan colonizing Korea was not a freak accident or a random event. It wasn't an invasion, which is something that I see a lot of even Korean people saying, like, oh, Japan invaded Korea. That's not what happened. It actually has a longer history that began in the late 19th century. So Japan was the first foreign country with which Joseon created a modern international treaty to ensure trade and diplomacy. This was in 1876 with the Konghwa Treaty. Yes, and that's spelled correctly. The next modern international treaty was with the United States in 1882, and then other European empires negotiated treaties with Joseon soon after. Prior to this, Joseon was mostly cut off from the rest of the world and did not officially allow international trade, except for with the Qing Empire, which was what China was at the time. So it had been like this since the 1600s. So you can imagine that these late 19th century treaties were quite important developments. But this also meant that many larger political and economic powers started to have their hands in Joseon politics and society, so many conflicts arose. The most defining of which was the Sino-Japanese War in 1895 between Qing China and the Empire of Japan, which was for sole military influence and representation in Joseon and in Manchuria, which is that area north of Korea. Japan won, and that is how they gained Taiwan as a colony. But the Joseon Queen, Queen Min, at the time was also in contact with the Empire of Russia and asking them for help in getting Japan out of Joseon. The Japanese authorities found out about this and they assassinated her, which further solidified the Japanese military and political influence in the court and on the peninsula. To assert his power and Joseon's sovereignty, King Gojong established Joseon into the Great Han Empire and installed himself as emperor. But it did not really work, as in 1905, war broke out between Japan and Russia over control of Manchuria, and also for influence over the Great Han Empire. Japan won again, and in the negotiation between Japan and Russia, which was mediated by the British Empire and the United States, Japan installed Korea as a protectorate. So what this means is that they took away Korea's international right to defend themselves. This essentially eliminated Joseon's sovereign military. This is what led to Japan's official colonization in Korea in 1910. The court's finances and power had been ruined from the previous international policies, so there was not much else that they could do, and one of Emperor Gojong's officials signed over political control of the peninsula to the Empire of Japan. And this date is wrong. This should be this is 1927, not 1910. But one of the things that stood in infamy, even into the modern time period, is that after Japan officially colonized and took Korea on as a colony, the colonial government general building, so the government building for the Japanese colonial authorities, they placed it in the courtyard in front of, in Gyeongbokgung, which is the Gyeongbok Palace, the main palace of Joseon Dynasty, Joseon period, where the king would oversee state affairs. So if you've ever, like I was just here literally last week, so you can still go and see this building is no longer there. They actually demolished it in 1995 and they removed it and moved it over to its own like park, and they have like the remnants spread about and you can look at it and whatnot. But so this stood as like a symbol of the Japanese control and power over Joseon, right, and over Korea. So there are essentially three periods within the Japanese colonial period. The 1910s are typically called the military rule era, which is defined by the Japanese colonial government using military police to assert dominance over the Korean people. As you can imagine, that only ignited Korean people's fervor for self-rule. This led to March 1st, 1919, which was the first major demonstration in 20th century Korean history. This photo was taken by a British missionary in Korea at the time. And you can see all these people gathered outside one of the palaces in Seoul. I think this is Cheongdeokgung. Does it say? Oh, Deoksugung. It's Deoksugung. And they were apparently yelling Manse. Manse means long live, and they mean by context long live Korea, right? Long live Joseon. So this confrontation between the Korean protesters and the Japanese military police became very bloody after this. But the Korean people did overwhelm the Japanese authorities, and the Japanese colonial apparatus gave in and started offering a little bit more freedom. And this gave way to the 1920s, which is called the era of cultural rule. It was during this time that industrial expansion and technological development exploded in Korea, brought on by Japanese colonial policies. This is why people call it cultural rule, because it was more a policy of ruling Korea through modernization of the different facets of society rather than military control. But this is also when Korean people started to move around, not just in Korea, but throughout the Japanese Empire as laborers. Particularly, people moved from rural areas to urbanized areas like Seoul. Seoul really expanded during this time. And they also started moving north to parts that are still part of North Korea, and also into that area north of Korea called Manchuria. Then in the 1930s and the Pacific War began, and this is the time that truly lives in infamy in Korean history. So whenever people talk about the horrors of the Japanese colonial period, they're really talking about the 1930s and 40s, so the war. So this is because the Empire of Japan, this was the war mobilization period. So Japan was trying to extract as many resources, both natural and human, from the Korean peninsula as it could in its effort to expand and take over all of East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The ideology that Japan used to get Japanese people on board was centered around the cult of the emperor and Japanese supremacism. So in Korea, they preached an ideology of unity between Japan and Korea under Japanese culture. This is when the bans on the Korean language and names were instituted. As the Japanese military expanded, the sexual slavery apparatus for the Japanese military also expanded, and many Korean women were coerced into it. Eventually, Korean men were also drafted into the Japanese military to serve particularly on the front lines as human fodder. When people talk about the Japanese colonial period as a horrible and evil time in Korean history, while the earlier periods were definitely not great or perfect, this period is really the one that they're referring to. So what stands out to you? Let's look at this postcard now that I've talked to you for like 20 minutes. Let's look at this as a postcard. It's a Japanese postcard, but it's depicting Jongno, which is an area in Seoul. It's kind of at the intersection of a couple different streets. I was just there. I was staying near it, actually, in Insadong, which is a little north of it. What do you notice about Seoul in the 1930s, according to this postcard? What stands out to you about it? How does it look westernized? So let's try and be specific. What do you see? Let's do this visual analysis kind of things. Focus on what we see. A streetcar. Yes, there's a streetcar. So they obviously had some form of like public transportation, right? And it's running on the wires. You can kind of tell up here, right? Yes, and the architecture looks kind of like like that kind of Greco-Roman revival, maybe. I'm really bad at architecture, so if I'm wrong, please tell me. But you know, these I always think of like the box buildings with the pillars on the facade, right? Good. Yes, lampposts, cars, public transportation, street lights. Yes, these street lights look kind of very European, what you might see in any city in Europe or in North America at this time, right? Yes, English. You see English, tobacco written in English here, right? That's kind of interesting. You know, English was definitely being taught at this time, but it wasn't that widespread. So good. Yes, brick buildings, very good. Yes, good. Yes, good. Streetwear. Here we go. Yeah, look at the diversity of what people are wearing. There's people who are in more traditional looking outfits, these white robes with these are, I think it's mostly men in this photograph. Actually, this is a woman, I believe. He has this white robe on here, and he has his traditional hat on. This is called a kot, right? But then he's standing right next to this guy here, who is wearing a suit. Exactly. He's wearing a suit and is carrying like something in his arm, maybe a briefcase or a portfolio of some kind, right? So there's a lot of mixing going around, right? There's a lot of, it's kind of old, rooted in old stuff, pre-modern stuff, but also rooted in like new, like westernized or modernized things as well, right? So there's quite a diversity of things going on technologically, culturally, right? At this time. Let me see. Was there anything else I was going to point out? I don't think so. Yeah, okay. So in Korea, really so during the Japanese colonial period and really prior to the Japanese colonial period, Korean was not written in Hangul very often. It was mostly written in Chinese characters, which is what you see on a lot of these signs. I should say that too, since we're talking about English. It's not really that they're using Japanese here, but Chinese characters tend to be read or understood with the same meaning between Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. So no matter if you're a Chinese speaker or a Korean speaker or a Japanese speaker, if you can read Chinese characters, you can kind of get the idea of what the meaning is from it. So, especially in a lot of signs, like here you can see over to the right under the tobacco, you can see, I think it's supposed to say dampe. Dampe is cigarette. And here they actually use an archaic letter from Hangul that's not used anymore. But yeah, so you see this mixture of Chinese characters and some Hangul, but Hangul was pretty rare. But very good to notice that difference, right? Because nowadays you won't see any Chinese characters if you're in Seoul. You'll see English, you'll see Japanese sometimes, and you'll see Korean, and you'll see Hangul. So, because Korea underwent this particular kind of modernization through Japanese colonization, we have a special word to describe that, and we call this colonial modernity. And so it describes the instance in which a society becomes modern, not necessarily through their own volition, right? So like Japan or Europe, they industrialized and modernized because as countries, those were policies that they made for themselves in order to industrialize. But that's not the case for Korea exactly. It was these colonial policies brought into Korea from Japan, right? And so it's this idea that the colonizer makes the colonized modern. And so in Korea, there were many aspects to this modernization, like we've seen. So they have the new technologies, especially transportation. There's also like radio, telecommunications, goods. There was a much diversity of goods as mass production started becoming more prominent and more accessible. Korea also started importing goods from Europe, North America, other parts of Asia. And this is probably one of the biggest and most important aspects, right? Is a modern, centralized, and pretty accessible education system was installed across Korea. It used to be your access to education during Joseon was very limited to your class, but that more or less kind of dissipated through the Japanese colonial period, and people were able to receive education at least through like a 6th grade level through primary school. So through primary school under Japanese colonial policy. But what's the catch? And I think you can kind of see, if you look at the details in this photograph here, hopefully it looks well. This is I don't know if this teacher is Japanese or Korean or what. Everything written here is in Japanese on the board, but this is in Jinju, which is a city in Korea. I'm trying to remember where it is. It's kind of south of this. It's south in Seoul. If I'm completely wrong, please someone tell me. But you see there's Japanese on the board. There's a Japanese flag here in the background, right? And he's teaching them about geography. So I find this photo quite interesting because what's the kind of the catch? Yeah, exactly, Katie. So yes, you have education, but it's more so based on what interests the Japanese Empire has, right? So yes, you can learn geography, you can learn math, you can learn science and whatnot. But the idea behind it isn't necessarily for your individual development, kind of like how we try to think of education, but there's always that looming kind of that imperialism ideology, right, behind it. So yes, exactly. Yeah, there wasn't a huge focus on Korean history, culture, or education. For example, if you went to university in Seoul during this time, which many Korean people did, there were no classes on Korean art. There were classes on Japanese art, but there was no classes on an idea of Korean art at the time, which is something that we talk about a lot in Korean art history, because that kind of left this harsh legacy on research. So modern art. What is modern art in Korea? So art was one of these aspects of life that modernized during Japanese colonial period. And the primary way that art became modern, this is just kind of generally speaking, was the expansion of media that artists used to make art. And I think a lot of us caught on to this, right? So what are some media that we've seen so far that expanded during this time? What were some of the ones that have stuck out to you? Some expanded media. Oil painting, yes. Oil paint is huge. Right, that's like the whole thing with it, right? Good. Yes, theater. Theater did expand too at this time. That's a very good point, Marley. It's not just visual art, but also the performance art, theatrical arts and performance art. Theaters became more prominent as well, and thus that means set art in designing sets and things like that also became more permanent. Yeah, so oil painting for sure. One of the big ones is new technologies were a major part of it. Oh, what am I saying? Hold on. Yeah, so photography was a major technological expansion, which became widespread. Expansion of media, European artistic traditions like oil painting. Also, what we see is something called hybridization. of European and East Asian traditions, which some of us have been talking about that a little bit with Gohidong. So hybrid is when artists combine elements from both East Asian and European arts, right? So, think of East Asian artistic traditions like ink painting. Those also continued to evolve and to flourish during this time. So we have photography here. We have ink and color still going on during this time. We have oil paint as well, right? So we have all of this expansion in media. And amidst all of this change happening through the colonial modernity, that means that there was a lot of problems for Korean people that developed. So what we're talking about mostly are the identity crises, right? Brought on by cultural assimilation and economic hardship, which continued to affect Korean societies even after liberation. So Korean people were second-class citizens in their own country, on their own land, and in their own homes for the entire period. And so this led to displacement from their homes and impoverishment as well. Korean people did not have as much freedom in Korea as even a Japanese settler had in Korea. Because of this, elites who existed since Joseon used their status to gain power and favor with the Japanese colonial authorities, which in the later period would exacerbate the class division in Korea as they became viewed as Japanese sympathizers or collaborators. So because of this lasting Japanese colonial rhetoric, that Korean culture and people were inferior to Japanese culture and people, this feeling becomes embedded in collective and individual psyches of Korean society and passed through the generations. So this is something we call generational trauma. All these aspects of colonial modernity are working together to disconnect Korean people from the culture, the land, and their way of life prior to colonialism. So thus, the question of Koreanness or being Korean becomes a central issue in Korean society during and post-colonialism, right? So, oh my goodness, we're running out of time. So what is identity? So let's talk about this a little bit more. What are some examples of identities that people have? Because as we looked at our portraits, some of us talked about, yes, ethnic, cultural. Your family is part of your identity. Yes, your national identity, cultural identity, sexuality, very important, right? Race, yes, your race is important. Your values, very good. Yes, what you value is also part of your identity. Your gender, exactly. So we have like kinship and friendship, right? So your family and your friends help define you. Ethnic and racial, which get kind of mixed up, but they're both, they're different but important. Geographical and national, good. So we have geography here, right? So where you're from, where you grew up, right? What country you grew up in or you were born in. Your interests and occupation. So this goes along with kind of your values, right? What are things that you like? What are things that you do? These also inform your identities. Religious, spiritual, so what you believe, again, going along with values. Gender and sexuality are very important, right? So how we express ourselves, how we want to look, how we want others to perceive us, and how we interact with others from a sexual standpoint, right? And then overall culture/cultural. I think all identities, no matter, all of these things can boil down to this idea of culture, right? Or being cultural. But the important thing to remember, and many of us have caught on to that, is that we're never just one of these identities at a time, right? We're always all of our identities all at once. And in different situations, some aspect of our identity might be more emphasized than in other situations, but it's something that we're always dealing with all of these, right? So we're going to look at some of the self-portraits here. What are questions that you ask yourself before making your self-portrait? Does the exterior match the interior? So what you feel, does it match the way you look? And what do you want someone to think when they look at your portrait? And what kind of identities do you want to express, right? So these are questions you probably dealt with, right? So I'd love to hear some of our answers in the chat as we look at these. I have only put the ones on that I found that are friends in our course actually made themselves. And so I'm going to tell you who did every single one of them. Hopefully you got to look around, right? So from left to right, we have Samantha Meyer's portrait. We have Lindsay's portrait, David Porter's portrait, Athena's portrait, Sam Avila's portrait, Anna's portrait, Ellie's portrait, and Amelia's portrait. And they are all wonderful artists who have shared their art with us. So thank you very much. Please thank them for doing that. This is not an easy thing to do. And these are all just so amazing, right? So not just if your portrait's here, but what were some things that you had to think about when you were either choosing your portrait from the museum collection or if you were making your own portrait? What were things that you thought about? Did you have any worries? Did you have anything specific you really wanted to share? Yes, very good. Yes, Ellie, and I think your collage really captures that. You wanted to highlight your values, what you find most interesting, what you like, how you like to spend your time, right? And spend your life, what you're doing, right? And we can see that here in your portrait for sure. With yes. And yeah, and they're all photos that they are all photos you've taken yourself, aren't they? Wow. Um, so you have even more of yourself put into it too, right? Good. Was it hard for anyone? Or were you kind of maybe like embarrassed or a little bit, if you're willing to admit it, a little bit worried about what other people might think about what portrait you pick? Yes. Yes, your color palette is very important, right, Katie? Yeah, which one you pick. Color can really communicate emotion, right? So you want to be able to pick one. Athena, it was very difficult for you. Yes, it is very difficult, right? Yes, exactly. And if you're creating it yourself, maybe it's a little bit easier to feel like this is me. But like Olivia said here, if you're finding someone else's artwork to represent you, it's kind of difficult because you're like, well, that's someone else. How can it also be uniquely me, right? Yes, good, Amelia. Yes, and the symbolism behind objects in your self-portrait, right? So objects aren't just there to be pretty all the time. They have deeper meanings for people. And I think in a lot of these portraits by our peers, the other non-human figures in them are very important to communicating some kinds of meanings, right? Good. Yes. Or just worried about a faithful representation of yourself. Yeah, exactly. Good. So now you can kind of now you can kind of see these are the types of things that artists, as we have artists in our class, think about when they're making a depiction of themselves, right? And so that's what Ko Hui-dong was thinking about too, probably, right? So what were some interesting parts of Ko Hui-dong that you learned about? Um, yes, it's hard to critique yourself. That's a very good point. Like you don't really know, like maybe for you, this is how you seem, but maybe someone else when they see it won't really think, oh, I don't think of you when I see that kind of picture, right? So Ko Hee-dong, he was right from a wealthy family of court translators and interpreters. And he learned ink painting under these are the two like prolific ink painters of the early 20th century, An Jung-sik and Jo Seok-jin. But then, right, he got sent to Japan as a government official in 1909, but he kind of lost his status because of Japanese colonialism. And so he ended up just attending the Tokyo School of Fine Arts. And that's when he started studying these kind of Western or European styles of art, right? So he had trained in oil painting. He worked in Japanese Impressionism, which we'll talk about in a moment. And he actually ended up switching back to ink right after Tokyo. He didn't really ever like oil very much. And he's very important. He established the Association of Calligraphy and Painting in Korea, which is basically they're the main like ink painting artist group in Korea at the time. So they really kept ink painting alive. So Japanese Impressionism is basically, so a lot of these Japanese artists, like this guy Kuroda Seiki, They went to France in the late 19th century, and they learned with these French impressionists and French academic painters, and particularly this one, which there's not a very good public photograph of this Raphael Collin painting, but it is in the Fukuoka Art Museum, which is in Japan. And he studied with artists like them who were doing more like academic impressionism, not like the kind of impressionism necessarily that you think of with like Monet, or like pointillism or like post-impressionist kind of things. It was a little bit different. And so it's this kind of style that developed among these Japanese artists as quote unquote, it's called yoga in Japanese, which means Western painting. But it was this style that they were mostly practicing in, right? And that's kind of the thing that Maya, or Professor Stiller, was talking about, such as modern art, what modern art style is in Japan and Korea at the time. So let's talk about the scholarly article a little bit here. So a lot of you have talked about this in your blog posts, which is really great because I forgot to tell everyone to do that. So what was her argument about Ko Hui-dong's portrait here? What did she say? What was the reason that he made this portrait and he made it the way that he did? Severia put this in your blog response, so. Yes, good. So he wanted to depict himself with the status he had before Japan. Yes, that's great. That's a really great kind of basic way to state her argument. Yes, and thus what Marley says here, for him it was personal, right? So she says it's distinctively personal, right? And so he's trying to take back this lost status. And so do you agree with this? Some of us agreed with this. Yes, exactly. Good. Yes. Why would you agree with it? Why would you agree with it? What's the alternative? If it's not personal, what are some possible alternatives to understanding this portrait? And she talks about them vaguely in the beginning. Good. Yes, Marley. Yeah. Depicting nationalism. The alternative is that it's just like this big political statement, right? And so, yeah, well, there's also this argument here too, which hasn't been. So, Kim Ji-yeon, who I know, she's really great. She's actually writing against what most people had said about this portrait prior to her publication, which is that everyone just kind of assumed, oh, this was a nationalist statement that he made. He was very pro-Korea and anti-colonialism, and he made this big political statement by doing this. And Kim is saying here, right, well, that might be kind of true in the context, but he also had, right, these very personal reasons for doing this, particularly the fact that he lost his own status due to colonialism, right? However, she kind of takes it and she says it's distinctively personal. And I don't know if she means to say that, because that would kind of mean, right, that, oh, maybe it's not political at all. He didn't have any political motives, but we'll see. So the reason this is such a big deal is because these here on the right are all of Ko Hui-dong's Korean peers at the Tokyo School of Fine Arts at the time. And this was their graduation self-portrait, and this is his. So what do you see already that's quite striking about Ko Hui-dong's portrait as opposed to these other ones? The size, the color. Yes, the color. And he's the only one in like Korean clothing or like Chosun kind of clothing, right? His is overall just way more bright and colorful. And I don't know if the frame is original. Frames are hard. Frames are very interesting, but they're very difficult to judge on. Yeah, it's bigger. There's something, it just seems like when you put it next to the other artworks, it seems like Ko Hee-dong was really trying to say something with his portrait, right? Because it's just so unique. And so that's why people are very obsessed with it and trying to figure out what was he trying to do, right? And she kind of juxtaposes that with this portrait, right? Which was not a public portrait. So what does she say about this one? Do you remember? This one we didn't really have to talk about for the blog, so I can see maybe we didn't think too deeply about this one. But this one's very important. Yes, very good, Ellie. Yeah. So this one is more focused on this kind of mixture of identities that are going on, right? So he's very relaxed. He's portrayed as this painter, maybe. Uh, but he still is kind of modern. And then very much the open shirt is very striking here. That was not something that anyone ever did in Korea, was to depict such a thing. It's even kind of taboo still nowadays to like be shirtless in public as a man in Korea. In North America and Europe, it's totally fine, but in Korea, not so much. Yeah, so this she actually says is like his exploration of the real self, right? So he's much more interested in his modernity and his maleness as well, right? Um, and his position as an artist. So there's a couple of things that Kim provides, right, to explain this. So there are some depictions of exposed body in contemporaneous works. So she had like, do you remember there was the magazine of the basically kind of Roman looking man with a tiger, right? And then there was another painting that he did that was to one of his friends, but it was depicting a man without a shirt on doing laundry. So he's very interested in this concept of like the shirtless or the man with his body completely exposed, right? So do you agree? What do you think about this interpretation of this artwork? If you saw this artwork, what kind of person do you think Ko Hui-dong would be? What idea about Ko Hui-dong do you get? Yeah, yeah, maybe even, yeah, he's definitely more modern, relaxed. I definitely think this one feels more personal or even private, actually, compared to the other one. Um, because yeah, humanizing. This is a very good word, Athena. Yeah, it feels almost humanizing. We actually get to see him in a setting, and he's not really removed. He seems like a part of where he is. Yeah, very everyday. That's a good, kind of mundane, maybe. Um, okay, let's see. Yeah, calm. It's definitely more calm. Yeah, exactly. And I think that might be part of why. Yeah, exactly. Very good, Elizabeth. I was just about to say, and I think that's part of why this one he never displayed publicly. It wasn't discovered. It wasn't discovered in his family's collection until the 70s. Yeah, by the National Museum. So this for him was definitely very personal, right? And he was definitely trying to explore or trying to depict himself in a way that may not have necessarily been uh, comfortable to display in public, right? Yeah, definitely. This is a good distinction here, Alex. Like he's in his own space and it's very private compared to like the other self-portraits, very professional, right? Good. Yeah, so I think there's also this idea of like intellectualism has been read into this painting. So like the books and the painting in the background, he's really just interested in showing how he's educated and whatnot, which I think maybe is part of it, but I don't think because like we said, this wasn't something he publicly displayed. So I think it should probably be more about his privacy, right? Yeah, exactly. I get the same feeling, actually, Ellie, when I look at it. Like, I'm not really supposed to be seeing this necessarily. But once an artist dies, we just put everything of theirs on display, which is that's a whole nother conversation to have. But so let's practice. We have like 10 minutes left. So sorry, this today was I feel like it's been very long. Let's practice our comparative visual analysis here. So a lot of us were on the right track last week with our comparative visual analysis, but I want to get us even more on track. So when we do a comparative visual analysis, what we don't want to do is talk about artwork A and then talk about artwork B. That's not what we want to do. What we want to do is we want to talk about artwork A and B's similarities and differences at the same together, right? So we want to talk about them in comparison, how they relate to each other. So what I suggest to students is to think about, okay, when you're describing an artwork, what do you talk about? Well, you talk about style, composition, icons, this kind of thing, right? Okay, so now what you should focus on then for comparative is, what are those descriptive similarities? What are those descriptive differences? So what's similar about their style? What's similar about their medium? What's similar about their icons? And then talk about what's different about those kind of things, right? And so those would almost be like two different paragraphs, just focusing on how they look different. And then your last kind of bit would be the interpretation part. So how are their meanings similar? How are their meanings different? Okay. And so a lot of you did this, but some of us still didn't quite do this. And we didn't get to practice last week because usually I do that with Minjung art, which is why you do the plenary response. But we're going to do that here like really quickly. So let's talk about descriptive similarities. So what are some things that are similar in the way that these two portraits look? And it can be even the most basic of similarities. Saying that two things are the same medium is a very important connection to make, right? Okay, so we have impressionist style. Good. So I would ask you, if you ever say it's impressionist style or you say it's Japanese impressionist style, you need to tell me why you think that. What about it makes you say that it is of that style? Good. The facial rendering. Okay, how so? How is the facial rendering similar? Good. Okay. Left shows a modern man portrayed in traditional Chosun garb with a stark expression, Japanese aesthetic. Relaxed kind of guard. The right is a man rooted in tradition, Korean Empire, while the right shows a portrait of modern man during occupation. Good. Okay. Good. So we're talking about similarities right now. I'm seeing a lot of differences. Differences are easy. Differences are easy to find between the way two things look. Similarities are not. So that's why I typically start with similarities. Good. Yeah. So obviously with the difference, one of them's in this kind of Chosun outfit. One of them's in a more modern or casual outfit, right? Good. The tones, the colors. This is very important. What Amelia says here. They have like this mixed color use, right? So that's part of the impressionism is you use these natural colors and you mix them together, right? Within one figure. They both have calm expressions. Very good. Yes, very good, Hayden. They both have this lighting that seems to be coming from the top right to the face of the figure. Do you kind of see that here? How the on our right, the face of the figure's face is lit on its left side, but our right side, right? Yeah, definitely. Yes, the colors blend together. Very good. Yes, they're both in the center. Very important. Both subjects are the center of the portrait. Exactly. Good. Right. Okay. Left is upright. Very good. Yeah, so I said, basically, they're both oil paintings on canvas. They're both images of the artist's self, right? They both have that serious face or gaze, that calm expression. So this is called a 3/4 view, which is basically when the face is kind of tilted to one side. So you get that lit side of the face in both portraits, but then the other side of the face is in shadow, right? You can't quite make it out as well. You don't need to know that term, but it's just something that can help you. And the color mixing, like we talked about, right? So they both have that impressionistic style by mixing the natural colors. Good. And we can't tell this by looking at it, but they both use these heavy brush strokes, which is also a part of that impressionism. And light and shadow. So descriptive differences. So I think we got a lot of them down already, right? So so this is the difference, right? So yes, both of them are at the center, but here the self-portrait with hat is chest up, and this self-portrait with fan is kind of like a seated full body almost. I mean, we don't see his feet, but we can see everything from his thighs upward, right? Which is quite a lot to see in a portrait, self-portrait. So this one has like a soft light blue kind of color, versus more of this has more of a brownish tint to it, right? Some of us talked about that. Yes, very good. I think that's my next one. Yes, an empty background versus an actual setting. I have no clue where Kokidong is in this painting here, right? And so, but here I absolutely know where Kokidong is, right, on the right. And then the officials wear versus like this open chest, relaxed wear, right? Good. Yes, centered on face. So again, looking at the subject's in the center, but we have the face, and then the whole body is kind of like the focus, right? Okay, so are there any questions about descriptive similarities and descriptive differences? I think we're getting, I know that was kind of quick, but I can tell we're getting on it. We're getting it. Good. Because you will have to do this, remember, for the comparative one on your midterm. All right, so now let's talk about interpretive similarities. So how are their meanings similar? What are some of the similarities that you can find between their meanings? What do you think? And it can be, again, it can be the most basic of things. It's okay to just, even if you think it's obvious, you should talk about it because it's not necessarily. Good. Okay, good. So the context, their historical context, they're both made during the Japanese colonial period. They're both good. Amelia here. They're both expressing the identity through clothing, identity of the artist. Good. The artist's individuality. Very good. Yes. So even though they have different takes on the artist, they're still expressing that, right? Good. Conception of self, represent the artist. Good. Yes, differences, we can do differences too. Yeah, so I said that first, right? They both represent the artist's self and thus convey his identity, right? I also said they both have an air of like intellectualism or elitism, right? So he's a modern man. He has these books and paintings and this fan, right? And well, even if he's a pre-modern Chosun person, he has this official's garb on, right? So, you know, these identities are different, but they're both still kind of more, they're kind of intellectual or elite. And then this is also, you could say, speaking about historical context and changes in art at the time, this is interpretive, right? European style painting among Korean artists. So these are both like techniques and styles that are quote unquote modern art. So they represent this historical moment where change is happening and what kinds of arts were popular in Korea. Oh yes, and then we said the symbolism of clothing, right? Good. The mood, I said, display of, oh yeah, masculinity also, right? These are both, you know, explains of is his position as a man. Okay, interpretive differences. So we have a couple here. What do we say? Yeah, so obviously tradition versus more relaxed, tradition official and like relaxed modern, right? Sense of self. Yes, pre-modern versus modern subject. I also said, yeah, like you don't see his body really in this one, but his body is fully on display, which kind of shows himself in a different light, right? And then little context, which we've gotten to, some of us have gotten to, little context in this portrait because there's no setting. And then this setting means, oh, we have a fan, we have books, we have paintings. So we have to start thinking about why would the artist include these objects or these props, right? So what are their symbolisms? What do those things mean, right? Good. So to end off, this is always interesting. Oh, so are there any questions about interpretive similarities and differences? I think we got it right. Okay, hopefully we do. So, just a little survey here. I thought this was interesting. A lot of us said they would go with, if they were Ko, they would depict themselves as like traditional, like Chosun Korean. 15 people said this. 5 people actually said mixture of tradition and new/modern. And what that meant was kind of different between people. But I also liked that many of us talked about how, well, maybe the subject is traditional, like he's wearing traditional outfit, but because it's oil painting on canvas, it still has this like new or like modern flair to it, or like it is still modern at the same time, right? And that's actually the kind of interpretation I tended to take about it too, because if you're an artist and you're working in oil and that's what you make, it's both modern and then you depict yourself in that way, and it's both pre-modern, right? And then 5 people said modern. So this is very interesting. All right, so you're welcome to go if you need to. Thank you so much for bearing with me. If you have any questions or need to talk to me about anything, please stay after so we can talk. Good luck on your midterm. If you have any questions about it, please email me as soon as you have them. Do not wait. Do not wait till Friday to start your midterm, because you will likely not finish, or if you do, you will not have done enough to get a good score. Thank you.